The sun peeked out from behind the mountains. The sky was a magnificent shade of purple that would soon be replaced by a beautiful light blue, a light blue that would become a symbol of the revolution to come. It was a chilly morning, like they always were out in the country. As Rosario Vidal and her husband Diego Burgos prepared themselves for the daily grind, their daughter, Salome, had started her day an hour prior. Salome Burgos Vidal had always been a bit rebellious. She was a wandering spirit. She could never stay still. She would rise every day at 4 a.m. and go for a walk. She loved to feel the breeze caress her sun-kissed skin as it played with the hem of her floor-length skirt. Her walks always led her to the same place, the edge of a small cliff where she felt as if she could see the whole island. This morning was no different. As she stood by the edge, the wind blew in her long brown curls, which came to an end toward her lower back. As her big, bright brown eyes overlooked the city, goosebumps made their way across her arms, although they were only visible on her forearms, which were not covered by the white cotton shirt she wore. The sight of the rising sun never ceased to amaze her. It all took her breath away. Salome sat down under a tree nearby and tried her best to describe what she saw. Sometimes it came in poetry, others in prose, but to her there was no way to capture the true essence of the island's beauty without experiencing it firsthand. Usually, it took her over an hour before she gave up. There just aren't words beautiful enough, good enough, worthy of being used to capture all this beauty, she thought. As she wrote, the sun made its way to its post high up in the sky, ready to spread its rays over everything and fill it with warmth. Diego Burgos, after rolling the cuff of his jeans and putting on his hat, grabbed his machete and headed for the sugarcane plantation where he slaved his days away. At the same time, Rosario had given up her search for her daughter and started preparing a mental list of all that needed to be done. Although for Rosario, the work was never done. She always had something to do or somewhere to be. Seeing her sitting was a miracle, but that was the way she liked it. Salome's fingers traced lines on the leather cover of her notebook. She ran a finger over the soft tan pages. The notebook had to be tied up by a piece of ribbon since it burst forth, seemingly breathing as some corners were folded in and random things had become bookmarks, mostly little gifts from her siblings. Salome was the youngest of 5, and for the last few years she had grown quite free as her home had been emptied out of her siblings. The oldest, Elena, was married and lived in Rincon with her husband. Soledad would have been 28 this year. She'd passed away soon after being born. After her came Raquel. She was the closest to Salome. 3 years ago, she'd left for Costa Rica, where she helped to run a school. A year later, their brother Mateo followed. Before going away, Raquel had given Salome her journal. "Fill this how only you could," she'd said the morning she was set to leave. As Salome's fingers ran along the binding, she could perfectly picture that day. They were standing at the docks. Her mother was a mess of tears, and she sought comfort in Diego's chest. Salome had been the last to say goodbye. She felt overjoyed for Raquel. A whole new world was waiting for her. But Salome now had to learn how to navigate the world without her, and her heart was breaking. The mountain air suddenly smelled of salt water, and she could see the wind making a frenzy out of Raquel's electric curls. Her caramel skin glistened in the warm sunlight, and behind her smile, Salome found comfort in the tears that welled up in her eyes. They held each other for a long time, or no time at all. Salome could no longer remember. She only knew they held on to each other until the ship captain gave the final boarding warning. As they broke apart, Raquel had reached into her bag and pulled out the little brown notebook. Salome had pressed it to her chest until she could no longer see the boat in the horizon. That same day, in that same deep sigh of farewells, she sat at the edge of the dock. Her parents and Mateo long gone by this point, and she'd first let inky thoughts set on that page. She looked at the same page every morning on the cliff, and she could still remember every emotion she had felt 3 years ago when her sister had left, and she sat at that dock and decided to let the beauty of the port of Jauco wash over the pain of losing another sister. Rolling mountains veiled by clouds that make a bride out of you. Tell me if it's the sea you marry, or is it the sun? Passing clouds that freckle the sky, tell me, are you running away or just passing by? Undulating susurrus ocean, are your waves terrifying or terrific? Parting sun, are you setting for me or rising for the rest? 3 years gone, and those pages had seen stories. Those early scribbles were corpses of who she used to be. She was no longer that 17-year-old girl who'd seen her best friend off on a warm morning. She was no longer the youngest of 5, and this was not the first crisp page. Her journal breathed for her only, because in it she lived. She kept poems and pictures, and sometimes the words in there were real only to her. She rushed through years and memories and only stopped when today's pages opened before her. The mountains before her were not the same imposing curves of years before. They were far below, and the clouds rested well above them. She looked on and traced every curve of the landscape, and her eyes could find no rest, no stopping point. She lifted her pen. Mountains curved like lips perched. No. Oh, no. Breeze, tell me why you... Breeze, you... Warning! Make leaves shake. Tremble? What secrets do you hide? Idiot, what lines do you write? Trees, green, emerald, jade, verdant, with flowers? Aromatic, blooming, lush. Mountains, the same giants as usual. Try something new. What about a house? Her eyes scanned her scribbles. It was some cruel joke that she felt such an urge to write, yet every time a pen met her hand, the words escaped her. Sometimes, as she stood in the kitchen humming a song over the rice, she'd think up pretty words to sing to the tunes. But when she finally had time to sit and write them down, she'd forgotten. Life had become a different sort of hustle and bustle for Salome after the nest had emptied. Elena had always been the one to do the cooking and cleaning along with Rosario. She was 10 years older than Salome, and being the firstborn, she had responsibilities that the other kids didn't. They were free to play, she was free to pick up after them. After Elena had married, Rosario had expected Raquel to pick up where Elena had left off, but Raquel was too busy playing with Salome. Salome's wandering spirit had been cultivated by her sister. Despite being 7 years older than her, Raquel had always felt closer to Salome than Elena, and she liked to wake Salome up early on Saturdays, cleaning days, although with Rosario every day was cleaning day. And they'd go play in the puddles and try to climb on neighbors' cows until Rosario found them and yelled at them to stop tormenting those poor animals. Rosario would have them wait for her when they reached the house, and while she was off looking for rags they could use to wipe down the table, Diego would come in with Mateo, both dirty from working in the garden, which meant throwing dirt at each other for 15 minutes, and would whisk them all away to the bakery. Rosario would expect them with a scowl that would soon vanish, as Diego planted a kiss on her cheek and handed her a slice of cheese flan. Salome was snapped back from her memories by a shuffling behind her. She raised her eyes cautiously, and hidden under the shade of her tree, she saw a group of men, coffee plantation workers, stumbling through the canopy that broke off toward her cliff. She didn't know any of the men, but their uniforms betrayed a part of their identity. They all wore the long-sleeved shirts with the trousers held up by dark leather belts. Their identities were mostly concealed by their hats, but one of them let his rest on his back, keeping it close to him with a piece of rope tied around his neck. A mess of black curl strands frantically in the breeze. Their hand-woven baskets, which were typically empty in the mornings, were filled with strange things. Salome could see scribbled pieces of newspaper, red and blue rags, and from the curly-haired man's basket, of which she could only see what spilled over since he had his back to her, she saw the sharpened edge of a bayonet, a rusting gun barrel, and freshly sharpened machetes. The men spoke in hushed voices of which Salome only caught hisses. Some larger fabric seemed to be pulled over the curly-haired man's basket, the wind making it undulate like the waves at the dock. A sudden gust blew the blanket away, and as the others went in search of it, the dark curls shifted quickly, looking for any witnesses, and coffee bean eyes were revealed to Salome at once. The man was darker than she was, handsome in a rugged way. Salome saw fear in his eyes, but for a moment. She hoped the terror in hers would make the man certain she would say nothing. And why would she? She understood nothing of what she saw and only hoped to leave quickly after they did. The blanket recovered and once more draped over the basket, the men left, none of them taking notice of Salome, except for the curly-haired man. She lingered over his appearance but for one more second as she allowed herself to breathe again, and as she regained her composure, she thought of his coqui-colored skin, a perfect shade of copper, trigueño as they called it, but Salome preferred her palette of the world better. Feeling safe once more, she gathered her things and quickly went home. She walked in through the small wooden door into her humble home. Her mother was in the kitchen muttering to herself as she prepared a sancocho to take over to Mrs. Pia Rodriguez's, whose husband had recently passed. Should I take her to her after the wake? No, then everyone will have brought something and I'll look insensitive. What if I take it before? Would that be weird? Ugh, I'll just take it when I take it, who cares? Rosario muttered to herself. Bendición, mami, Salome said as she took a seat at the table. Dios te bendiga, mija. May he also have mercy on you so I don't kill you. How many times have I told you? You can't just leave the house without saying anything. I'm sorry, mommy, but you know how I am. I can't stay still, and if I wait for you and father to wake up, I'll miss it. Miss what? She said, sounding increasingly aggravated. The sunrise. The sunrise? Mija, you can see the sunrise out the damn window. Why in the world do you have to wander off to God knows where to see the stinking sunrise? It's not the same. There's a little cliff. Rosario cut her off. A cliff? Do you know how dangerous that is? My God, I can see the headlines now. Girl falls off a cliff for sunset. How stupid that sounds. That's how stupid it is. Rosario's voice was getting louder. She was trying to stay calm, but it was becoming harder and harder. You don't understand, mommy. I can see everything from there. The view is spectacular. It's exactly what I've been dreaming of writing about for years. Ay, mija, you're 20 years old. When would you give up this dream of being a poet? You said yourself that you're not very good at it. Poets are born, not made, so forget that crazy dream once and for all. Ay, mommy, you just don't get it. You should come up with me someday. Hang off a cliff with you. Keep dreaming. At this, Salome rolls her eyes. She knows better than to argue with her mother, but to her it's just too much fun not to. Mom, said Salome after giving her mother a few minutes to cool down. What, mija? Rosario's eyes never left the swirling pool before her, occasionally raising the spoon to her lips to check the flavor before inevitably adding another pinch of salt. I saw something this morning. These men had machetes. Her voice trailed off as she tried to make sense of something she didn't understand. Rosario seemed shocked and confused by Salome's question. She wasn't one to really ask her much other than what was necessary. Rosario put down a pan she had been vigorously washing and with a deep sigh turned to her daughter. Hands clutched to the edge of the sink behind her. What are you on about, child? They were probably plantation workers. It's not like it's the first time you've seen a machete in your life. Heck, you used to play with your fathers when you were younger. That's the thing, though. They weren't sugar plantation workers. They weren't dressed like Baba. They worked at a coffee plantation. I could tell from their uniforms. Rosario's eyes widened in terror. Mommy? Salome? You need to stop this foolishness. You're going off at the break of dawn to an isolated place and now you're telling me there's wackos running around with machetes. Mommy, it's not like that. They weren't going to hurt me. Ay, Salome, for God's sake, you trust a snake if it gave you an apple, I swear? Mija, you are not the same 13-year-old girl that used to sneak off with Raquel. When will you start acting like an adult and stop being so naive? She brought her hands to her chest. Salome knew that look. Her mind took her back to a late night in 1861. Raquel had woken Salome and Mateo up, and they snuck off to a nearby creek. The morning had been washed by the softly rushing water, which brushed against the smooth moss-covered rocks. A 13-year-old Salome danced around the creek, holding hands with her sister. They were all merrily humming the tunes they knew so well. Those Rosario crooned as she cleaned up the house on Saturday mornings, and the ones Diego hummed every night to get them to sleep. Suddenly, the music in Salome's head went out, and the moonlight got watered down by tears. Her eyes searched in the darkness until she found Mateo's thin body among the rocks. He'd slipped on the moss and had gone unconscious. He's fine, Salome. Just get Mom, Raquel's cool voice said. A barefoot Salome ran home, and as she crossed the doorframe, she ran right into Rosario's soft nightgown. The anger in her mother's eyes was washed away by a fresh wave of panic at the fear of Salome's eyes. Rosario held on to her daughter until she calmed down. Diego came down the hallway, rubbing his still sleepy eyes. Now what is going on here? His voice was still somewhat in that dreamy state, not quite asleep, not quite awake. Rosario shrugged her shoulders as she confronted Salome. Mija, what's wrong? What happened? Rosario's voice was less stern than usual as she placed a kiss on the top of Salome's head. Mateo, we went down to the creek and we were messing around and Mateo slipped. Raquel says he's okay. Salome's voice was choked among her sobs. She raised her eyes to her mother and quickly, following Rosario's gaze, met her father's. He was already pulling on his boots. Salome broke off her mother's embrace and took off with her father. When they returned to the creek, Mateo was awake, laughing and splashing water at Raquel. Salome breathed a sigh of relief. Her mother was right. She wasn't the same 13-year-old girl. Now, Salome, I don't have time for your silly nonsense. There is a lot to do, and I'd appreciate it if you talked less and helped me out more. Salome looked down at the table. Her hands were clasped to the edge tightly. After a second, she decided it was best to just let it go. Her mother meant no harm. I can go to the market for you if you'd like, unless you had something else in mind. No, that's perfect, sweetie. Get the list. I left it on the vanity in my room. Rosalia's eyes finally left the dirty dishes and the cooking food and met Salome's with a loving smile. Salome made her way through the streets. She passed mothers who walked with their children on their way to school, men hustling to make deliveries or to get to their respective jobs. The shops were just opening. The delicious smells of bread and pastries filled the air, and in the plaza, the older gentlemen played dominoes as pigeons flocked around, hoping to find their next meal in the crumbs of unsuspecting walkers. Salome remembered the days of her childhood when Elena, Raquel, Mateo, and she would run around her mother's skirt, pulling her every which way toward bakeries and shops and away from classrooms. Diego would walk with them for a bit before joining the clusters of plantation workers going all over the town and the island. Their mother would be all smiles until the babe started pulling at her skirt. Then her stern face would get all her ducklings to behave and follow her obediently. I should have brought a hat, thought Salome, as she tried in vain to shield her eyes from the blinding rays of the sun. As much as she didn't like having her vision impaired, she loved that wonderful feeling she got when the rays hit her back and warmed her. It was still early in the morning, so the light breeze made the walk easier on her. The gravel sunk into the dirt, which was still soft from the night's rainfall, making Salome's steps sink. She thought back to all the tiny shoes she'd lost to that wet gravel in those morning crowds when, while playing with Raquel, they'd been forgotten or consumed by bigger shoes in the caked dirt. As she approached the market, she saw Mrs. Pia Rodriguez swatting flies away from the fresh produce that rested in their wooden nests, ripe for the picking. Mrs. Pia was always a nice lady. She had given catechism classes at the town's church for years, and she'd always been great with the kids. Salome remembered how once she was Pia's favorite student and how she cried when she found out that Mrs. Pia wouldn't be her teacher anymore. Mrs. Pia had found this very touching, and to calm Salome down, she promised that she could come by her class whenever she wanted or visit her home, which was down the road from Salome's. A smile crossed Salome's lips as she looked at Pia's tiny wrinkled frame. She still saw traces of the 46-year-old who taught her. Pia was still just as thin, yet her back no longer stood in the precise and rigid posture of perfection Salome had admired at 6 years old. It had a new curvature, yet the same poise still carried her. As her gaze lingered on Pia, Salome was no longer at the market, but in a stuffy classroom on a Saturday morning. The produce crates were now neat little rows of chairs and desks, and the fruit had become rowdy 6-year-olds with empty notebooks. Little Salome sat in her desk trying to imitate Pia's poise and posture. Her little body was lost in the puffy underlining of her pink dress. Her little feet swung from her chair, yet she stopped them by crossing her ankles. Her scribbles never quite looked like Mrs. Pia's beautiful cursive, but that didn't matter. She always made smiling doodles on her notebook after classes. She was the only one who'd taken notes. Salome rarely ever understood what her notes said, but she simply enjoyed copying the words and trying to curve and curl her letters like Mrs. Pia did. Mrs. Pia's light brown hair was held together in a messy bun by a bright red pencil. It was always the same bright red pencil. Mrs. Pia never rolled up her long white sleeves, and her blue checkered skirt reached to the end of her ankles where sand-colored boots peeked out. Little Salome always wondered how she put up with the heat in the stuffy classroom. Even her below-the-knee dress with their short sleeves caused her discomfort. So she was always impressed by Pia, who never seemed to sweat or show discomfort in her warm clothes. After class, Mrs. Pia would always give Salome a big hug before sending her home, and many times her glasses would get stuck in Salome's untamed curls. Pia always felt bad afterwards as Rosario tried to untangle them. It always made Salome laugh, and Pia usually ended up taking them off, allowing Salome to play with the pretty pearls of her glasses chain as her mother tried not to rip her hair out. Mrs. Pia was changed, yet still the same comforting, familiar woman. She still wore her very modest clothes, but they were all darkness now. The pretty pearl chain was still there, even if the lenses were thicker every year. The only color that lived in Pia now was the bright red pencil that still held up her hair. Mrs. Pia picked up some fruit and checked for the ripest of each kind. She wore a kind smile on her face, but in her bloodshot eyes, one could see the sadness she felt after losing her husband. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said Salome in a kind voice as she approached the wooden crates. "Oh, Salome, how you've grown, my child. Why, you're a beautiful woman now. You must have many suitors knocking down your door." "Not at all, Mrs. Rodriguez. How are you feeling? Is there anything I can do for you?" "Oh, I'm doing well, sweetheart, but thank you. Everyone's been so kind to me." "Well, what are neighbors for?" "Indeed, Well, I'm in a hurry. There's still so much to do before the wake. It was lovely seeing you, Salome. Say hello to your mother for me. Of course, said Salome, smiling as she waved goodbye to Mrs. Pia. The trip to the supermarket felt quick, but in reality it took Salome more time than she'd anticipated. Her mind kept wandering off to the sunrise, the curly-haired man, and the Spanish Empire. She struggled to grab all her bags, and just when she believed she found the perfect way to carry them and made her way outside, one of the bags slipped, spilling the contents everywhere. As Salome gently set down the other bags, a helping hand reached over and helped her collect her fallen items. Thank you, kind sir, she said, finally looking up at the warm brown eyes that hadn't left her mind since earlier that day. Why, hello, stranger, said the man. Oh, hello, shouldn't you be working? Shh, he said, holding a finger to his lips and smiling. Sneaking off? Not exactly. I'm running some errands for Mrs. Rojas. What type of errands? That is a secret, my dear, he said, kissing her hand and running off.